Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Aaron Pelker, and I work in community engagement at the Missouri Historical Society. On behalf of MHS, I would like to welcome you to STL History Live. We're excited for you to join us virtually. So thank you for being here. That I'd like to introduce our guest presenters. Robert Stout from Strategic Outreach and Planning LLC is joining us today, as well as Nicholas Pinter, Schliemann Chair at Applied Geosciences at University of California, Davis. Robert and Nicholas, thank you for being here today.
Here.
I need to quickly mention, absolutely, I need to quickly mention a few details about how today's program will run. This will be a roughly 30-minute presentation followed by a 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. You can submit questions through the Q&A button on your toolbar, so please know that we will do our best, but we may not have time to answer all those questions today. But today's presentation is being recorded, so if you'd like to view it again or share today's presentation with others, it'll be posted on the Missouri Historical Society's YouTube channel early next week. As always, your feedback is important to us, so we would really appreciate if you could answer a few questions for us after the program. A Kobo Toolbox survey will soon open in another tab on your browser, so please keep an eye out for that when you leave today's session. I know that some of you watching are Missouri Historical Society members, so thank you. We're grateful for your support. And if you're not a member, but we would love for you to consider joining today. Soon I will share a link to our website in the chat box, so please keep an eye out for that. We also sincerely thank city and county residents for your tax contributions to the Zoo Museum Tax District. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Robert Stout. So thanks again, everyone, and enjoy.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm hoping this is working as I'm speaking to the computer now. And I wanted to start out my presentation, which I've entitled Life on the Mississippi and Its Tributaries, and really along this theme of trying to live with the river and the challenges that go with that. The first thing that I'd like to talk about a little bit is the historical perspective. I've got a couple of graphics here. The one on the left shows you the changes in land use.
Hey, Robert, sorry to interrupt. You're going to have to start sharing your screen first. We don't see your screen.
Sorry.
Yeah, no worries.
All right, let me go back to how I do that. I'm sorry. How's that?
Yeah, you'll want to go to the share screen on the bottom of your toolbar, the green button. Yeah, there you go. Perfect.
So I'll start over, I suppose. My name is Robert Stout. I am currently operating under Strategic Outreach and Planning LLC, and you see also I've listed here Midwest Waters Initiative. This is an effort to try to develop some discussions around the state, around the Midwest on water issues. And my background, I should share a little bit. I was employed for 20-some years with the Missouri Department of Natural Resources. I served as the chief of policy there for a period of time. And also sat on the Upper Mississippi River Basin Association, which is an organization that's oriented toward 5 states in the Upper Basin that's organized to deal with significant water issues in the Mississippi River Basin, in the Upper Basin specifically. So my presentation today really comes from an interest in this issue and working over my career on these kinds of challenges to deal with flooding and other environmental issues in the basin. So let me see if I can move to the next one. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how we got to where we are right now. And essentially, there's been settlement in this part of the United States, and prior to it being the United States, for 200 years or more. In the period of time before Western settlement or European settlement, the systems were natural systems. The floods that were documented over the years took full advantage of the floodplain. On the graphic that you see on this slide, you'll see to the left there's a box with 3 views of the same section of channel, and you can see over time how these the use of this particular resource has changed. You know, you had a much different land usage in 1809, obviously, than you do in 1989. I just wanted to show you that from the standpoint that human activity has made a lot of difference in the basin. So, of course, agriculture, building infrastructure within the floodplain and beyond, all of these things impact how the basin reacts. The graphic on the right, and I apologize for not being a great graphic, but it kind of shows you as with an overlay over the St. Louis and American Bottoms area in our part of the basin. You can see how the historic floodplain has moved across that area. Most of the area that shows you these historic channels right now is, of course, behind a levee, and it's built up in urban areas and agriculture and industry. So we've used all of the landscape in a way that makes sense to the economies and to our effort to benefit ourselves and our communities. But we've also put a lot of stress on the natural infrastructure that's in place. So, went backwards. So we've got, of course, a history of challenges in living with the river over this period of development. You have recorded floods, obviously, before 1927, but the Great Flood of 1927 made a lot of difference in terms of the way that we looked at the river and how we were going to be able to harmonize with it. Prior to 1927, levees only was the approach that we took to protect communities and infrastructure from the river. There were large levee systems that were both public and private. There was dredging on the river. All of these things were an attempt to get the water off the landscape into the river and past where the community was. But that effort really showed its weaknesses in 1927 when we had this historic flood that affected millions of people, destroyed an incredible amount of infrastructure along the river. And frankly, a lot of these flooding events have recurred over the years, and each time it happens, we take another step toward trying to decide how we're going to interact with the river itself. So the next slide I have is kind of a chart that shows you that transition as you move through the period where you have this different approaches to flood risk reduction and mitigation. So initially, of course, we are willing to live with the floods, and when you have small communities and less infrastructure, that makes a great deal of sense. We like the land in the floodplain, and we like to be able to use it and drain it for agriculture and other uses. So we start to try to control this through building levees and structures and trying to protect the communities and resources we have. Then also we recognize that that nature keeps overwhelming those attempts to protect these resources, and so we have to figure out other ways to try to adapt and build resilience into the system and to manage the risk that's involved. So the ways that we've managed those risks historically have often been structural in the way that we've approached it. We've built levees and flood walls. We built locks and dams. And the Mississippi River and Tributaries program that came into being after the Great Flood of 1927, with its floodways and spillways and reservoirs and levees that were operated by the federal government, the Corps of Engineers and Mississippi River Commission. I've got a few graphics on this slide that show you some of the major structures that have occurred over the time. It's interesting to note, and a lot of people don't understand this, but for instance, the lock and dam systems on the upper Mississippi River are not for flood control, they're just for navigation. So they aren't really able to manage the flood risk to the extent that levees and other systems that are designed for those particular purposes are able to do so. But they do represent our attempts to manage the river. So then what do we know, or what should we know by now? And really the answer to that question is that everything is connected. Everything in the watershed is connected. The water that lands in the uplands doesn't stay there. And our attempts over the last 200 years have been to get it off the landscape as quickly as possible, to channelize streams, to put a lot of hard surfaces in place, and stormwater efforts to control stormwater. So in order to really understand the problems that we face within a community, we need to also understand the problems and identify solutions. There's a quote by H.L. Mencken that I particularly like, which is that for every complex problem, there is a solution that's simple, neat, and wrong. And that's oftentimes the way that we've approached the problems in the watershed. So what is a good approach then for dealing with trying to manage these river systems? And what we've come to over the years is we're kind of now in the watershed era of comprehensive management. And what that means is that we look at these systems, and you need to consider all of the systems within a kind of a matrix. You know, you need to consider the geography, how the hydrology, the hydraulics of the system works. You know, watershed is basically a drainage basin. So you look within that watershed and you look at the problems that are in the watershed, and you need to know who's interested in these problems. Who are the stakeholders, the people that live and work and recreate and such in the basin. And you need to have a plan to address the challenges that you're facing in the watershed. You need to set priorities, and you need to find resources to deal with those priorities, and set up some kind of a system of accountability, governance to ensure that you're making progress on it. So when you're talking about the Mississippi River Basin, you're talking about a lot of geography. You know, this is this particular graphic shows you the extent of the Mississippi River Basin. And we live in Missouri. We're here in the upper Mississippi River Basin. Still a huge geographical area. It's different than the other basins. All of them are managed a little different, but I'm going to focus basically on the differences between the upper Mississippi River Basin and the lower. The upper basin is essentially locks and dams. It's not controlled for flooding with those structures, but it's heavily leveed all the way up and down the river. These levees themselves pose certain challenges because as they have gotten higher and with flood fighting and such, there's always the potential that there's a weak place someplace where it's either going to overtop, or if you're protected in one area, it might be threatening another area. So that's different than the lower Mississippi River Basin, which is the home of the Mississippi Rivers and Tributaries program. That particular program has actually managed flows throughout the lower basin through a series of levees, floodways, spillways, and channel work. So it's a much more managed area than the upper basin. It's all under one authority, which is the Mississippi River Commission. And it has been successful in dealing with the record floods that have occurred since 1927. But if you'll remember, in the 2011 flood, the Birds Point floodway was activated and took some of the pressure off of that system, and it got through that particular event without any major failures. So you know, you have a watershed and you're looking at this, but how do you implement a watershed approach to dealing with issues of this sort? And you have to think about scale. So if you look at the size of these basins, they're huge. You have to be able to find the right limit of geography in order to look at a set of problems and solutions that you can deal with. And that's why the watershed process can help you do that. It can help by identifying a drainage basin. Maybe the Merrimack River Basin is a good example. And you think about, what do you know about that basin? Share that information with the stakeholders in that particular basin. Identify and agree on priorities. Agree on a plan. Find the resources to implement the priorities that you've established, and then keep that process moving forward. So who needs to be at the table then? And identifying the stakeholders is really dependent upon what geography that you're looking at. Who lives there? Who works there? Who recreates there? Who has information, all this technical information that you need in order to understand and address the problem? And who has the resources that can help to solve those problems? Who's interested in the resources in the watershed itself, that the natural resources, the environmental resources? So when you're talking about stakeholders, you need to have the right people at the table. And one of the key areas is having the right resources in order to address the problem. I started listing these resources on this chart, and you can see the huge number of programs and really all these dollars that are represented in all of these boxes of potential people that might be engaged in order to solve problems within the watershed. It's a daunting process of getting all of these folks, the appropriate staff, to the table to talk about these issues and to be able to allocate resources to address the particular challenges that you want to do. That's all of these programs most all tend to be very compartmentalized. We call it siloed. And essentially you have to kind of have some process to bring them together. And that's why I'm kind of advocating a watershed process where you have a forum within a particular geography that can accomplish that. So how can an individual engage? How can a community engage? And there you need that forum within that geography, within that watershed to get the right people to talk about the issues involved. One of the challenges of engaging is knowing where that conversation may already be occurring. And a helpful thing to look at here is what's been done in the past, all these studies and plans and tools that we may already have in place that might be helpful. So I've got a few of these documents that we're going to post later on with links and such so you can get to them. But historical documents, like from the 1993 flood, which was a major event in the Mississippi Valley, the Sharing the Challenge, Floodplain Management in the 21st Century. Room for the river, give the river enough of its floodplain in order to function in a way that will help address some of these problems. And then there's been a lot of really good work done recently since the 2015 Merrimack River Basin floods. There was the Corps of Engineers and other partners developed the Lower Merrimack Multi-Jurisdictional Floodplain Management Plan. And this is a really excellent kind of planning effort that lays out a whole set of analyses and proposals for dealing specifically with these problems in order to try to get at the solutions. Part of that effort also included getting Wichita State University, the Environmental Finance Center, to develop a kind of a handbook for the Merrimack Basin that identifies the issues, the communities, the potential resources that might be available. So there's a lot of valuable information that's already been put together. One of the excellent tools that USGS has put on the internet, and this is available, there's a web link here that we're going to be able to provide to you, that where you can actually go into this tool and look at the area that you're living in and identify the flood risk at various points in time, and manipulate the tool in order to analyze where the risk actually occurs. It's another great resource. This particular product is Naturally Resilient Communities. Then it actually has a whole set of tools and in an effort to help communities evaluate where they can perhaps tap into solutions for their problems. Another great product has been put together by TNC, where they have their Lower Merrimack floodplain tool. So that the Wichita State University, their Finance Center has a tool to look for funding to solve these problems. So all of these things together can be tools that individuals and communities can access in order to follow through on the promises that that are theoretically laid on the table with these studies and reports that have been developed. So, just to conclude, if you're going to work within, if you're a community living within a threatened area or any community within a watershed, so that's all of us basically. What you need in order to make progress is you need a plan. You need to settle on a plan to implement, and you need to get the folks that are interested in that particular planning effort to buy into the priorities that can help solve these problems. At the table, you need to bring the right resources, the representatives from all of those agencies that were listed and organizations and resources that could actually help solve some of the problems. And then you need to have some sort of way to monitor that you're making progress and to keep moving forward. Developing collaborations is one of the hardest things that you can do, but there are ways to do that by developing forums within watersheds and getting folks together to talk about these problems within their communities and to identify strategies to solve them. So I'll kind of stop there, and as we get back into questions and answers, I can pass it off to Dr. Pinter at this point.
Okay, thank you very much, Robert. Very interesting. Good morning, everyone. I'm looking forward to our conversation here. I guess we get a chance for some question and answer at the end of the hour. So I'm going to share screen, and hopefully this will come off without a hitch. So I'm hoping you're seeing my my title slide here. If not, someone yell out. I've been asked to talk today about managed retreat, and we'll talk about that in just a couple of minutes. But I wanted to sort of springboard off of Robert's presentation a little bit and talk about flooding in the St. Louis area on the Mississippi River in particular. So I've been following this for a while, and this is a diagram I put together about 2014. What you're looking at here is the biggest flood in each year over the instrumental record at St. Louis. So this is the stage of the water. This is how high it gets, the Market Street gauge. And this is a great record. So this is a very precise and homogeneous record at St. Louis, now stretching almost 160 years. It's one of the best records of flooding, certainly in the US. On an average unmodified river, the water gets above the top of the banks, which is about 30 feet in St. Louis, roughly every 1 year in 3. So that's what happened in the early part of the record, but not so much in the latter half of the history of the river here. So we highlighted the 10 largest floods each year in orange and red, so they kind of jump out, kind of striking that they were all in the latter half of the record. So I pulled this out recently and updated it a couple times. So what must have been around 2019, showed that pattern has continued up to the present. So a couple more big flood years, then I pulled it out again this year to update it one more time, and here we go again. So consistent pattern of the magnitude and frequency of flooding on this stretch of the Mississippi River getting greater over time. And that's not the major focus of today's talk, but I thought just put this into context, why we need to do something about flood risk. This is residents along the river and within the watershed. The big question is why this is happening. And again, not the focus of today's talk, but this is a diagram I sometimes use to show it. I just wanted to mention that a large body of academic research is focused on the so-called in-stream factors along the middle Mississippi River. That stretch of the Mississippi River is driving most of this trend. And here are some in-stream factors that we might talk about maybe another day. But today, again, talking about managed retreat. So by way of introduction, what I sometimes tell people is my students and research staff and I came to this research because of the flood hydrology, but we stayed because of the history. So I understand some of you are history buffs, us too. We think that adaptation and adjustment to flood risk, how you manage the flood risk, makes for great stories and makes for important lessons about how we deal with flood risk headed into the future. So managed retreat is a term that comes out mostly out of managing for coastal risk. And I really like this diagram. This is from the BBC. I think it was from sort of a teen educational website they put together. So this lists a whole bunch of strategies for dealing with coastal erosion, coastal hazards. So it ranges at the top of the diagram from what we'd call hard engineering solutions, like seawalls, just like St. Louis has its flood wall. And then other things that are specific to coastlines, groins with a funny British spelling, and then some intermediate factors, and there is managed retreat at the bottom. So the idea is that managed retreat, at least in a coastal setting, is dealing with your risk, your long-term risk, by managing with nature rather than against it. So although introduced in the context of coastal management, managed retreat is very much a part of the portfolio for dealing with flood risk as well. So it incorporates a bunch of different elements. So here are some strategies that the US government and many state and local governments are investing in for managing, even retreating from risk along our river corridors. These are pictures from the Illinois side of the river. Persistently flooded homes, you can elevate them. That's a form of retreat, right? You're getting up and out of harm's way. There are great pictures of either the residents of this house on the left or others fishing off the front porch in the midst of some of the greatest floods in recent history. Their belongings high and dry, and apparently the residents safely, happily in those residences. And on the right, that's a property acquired using FEMA and state funds in Illinois, and moving the residents elsewhere. So a bunch of that has been done. This is a slightly outdated slide. I think in Illinois, the number is somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 today, if memory serves correctly. Number of structures that have been acquired and permanently removed from flooding along the Mississippi, Illinois, and other Illinois waterways. So these are certainly a form of managed retreat. It is one of the principal tools in FEMA's toolbox for managing that risk. But I wanted to talk today about a different area of managed retreat. And it's a small tool in the overall toolbox, but we think a really interesting one. So this is community relocation. That is the wholesale relocation of towns out of flood risk, typically after a disastrous flood. So some of you are familiar with Valmeyer, Illinois. This is the international poster child of community relocation to get off the floodplain. So we'll talk some more about Valmeyer in just a minute. It is not the only example. So let's talk about community relocation as a flood mitigation and management strategy. So this approach has advantages and challenges. So the advantages, certainly first and foremost on that list, is when you do this and do it right, you have permanently eliminated the risk of flooding for individual residents and whole communities. We have a paper right now in review with a journal calculating these things can be cost effective. They actually pay for themselves over time. And a bunch of other benefits, like you maintain your whole social fabric of a town, of a community intact. But community relocation has challenges. First and foremost, it is large, in some cases an overwhelming task. And it is not appropriate for every place. So the important thing when we talk about Valmeyer and the other examples I want to go through today is that this is not a solution everywhere. So we were down in Australia a bunch last year, looking mostly, I'll talk a little bit about river flooding down there, but also sea level rise, coastal erosion threatening, like Sydney, Australia, their Gold Coast. You know, managed retreat is a very limited tool there. Just the trillions of dollars of infrastructure in a situation like that make it almost, not completely as we'll discuss, impossible to move wholesale out of harm's way, and certainly make the economics of it enormously more challenging. However, at least in the US, 20 to 30 generally smaller towns, several hundred people up to a couple thousand people, have partially, or in many of those cases, completely moved off the floodplain. So again, this is an interesting and potentially useful history that I've been asked to review today. So let's not begin with Valmeyer. Let's go back to what is the first well-documented floodplain relocation in US history. It was on the Missouri River upstream of the confluence. Niobrara, Nebraska in the late 1800s was a thriving rural hub, a marketplace there. 475 inhabitants as of 1880, and thriving commerce. So this was a hub of the region at the time. 3 general stores, a harness shop, 2 blacksmiths, 5 hotels no less, and the other things on the list. Until it was hit by severe, in 1881, this was ice jam flooding on the Missouri River, put the town completely underwater. So the town realized that it had built too close to the river, and there were advantages to that, transportation and economic access, but they resolved to move the entire town. It was about a half a mile up the hill with the tools available to them. This was, in many cases, a physical move. So there's some great archival images of that. You see houses put on wheels, on carriages, on rollers, and dragged by oxen and horses that half mile up the hill. So we've actually gone in there and done surveys of that. So one of the great things, one of the great historical footnotes of Niobrara is they didn't move quite far enough. So what you see, the blue dots on the left, are structures that were, homes and businesses in Niobrara. And in 1950, the town boundary is the bold yellow line there. They didn't move far enough. So for a couple of reasons, the dam was built. It caused a bunch of flooding that no one expected after the first move, and they had to move a second time. So they moved even further up the hill, almost entirely removing all the blue structures, just a couple of structures in the margin of the town there in the sort of the green color. And the red is the map of all the structures in Niobrara today up on top of the hill. And the final footnote for that is, if some of you remember, 2 years ago, great big flooding occurred on the Missouri River and on the Niobrara River in particular. There was a dam burst and everything upstream of that, and a wave of water came through. If the town had not moved the second time, not to mention even the first time, that entire area, all of the blue structures would have been underwater, completely wiped off the map, but for this relocation. As it was, got just a couple structures at the very corner of town, a couple of these things right down, right at the margins, that shows the danger of just cutting it too close to the line. Like a quickie market got underwater, but this relocation turned that recent flood from a minor footnote, from what would have been, which was a total disaster, into a minor footnote in the news. I want to just very quickly mention a couple of other much discussed examples of managed retreat and community relocation. 1937 was a year of enormous flooding, not on the Mississippi mostly, but it began on the Ohio River and continued then on the lower Mississippi all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, including catastrophic inundation of towns all along the floodplain of the Ohio River. So 2 towns, Leavenworth, Indiana, and Shawneetown, Illinois, resolved never for this to happen again. They had been flooded again and again and again. Shawneetown in particular was a real hub. It was at one point the largest community, the largest jurisdiction in the state of Illinois early in the 19th century. They resolved to move entirely off the floodplain. These are great examples. I strongly recommend you take a look at David Welke's book, The 1,000-Year Flood. It's about the 1937 flood and the moving of Shawneetown, Illinois in particular. Just want to mention another example that we got really excited about because we didn't know about it. So we came across one line in a 1957 paper that referred to the community of Odena, Wisconsin, and it called it the largest example of floodplain relocation in US history, which was a surprise to us because we had never heard about it. And we called people up in Wisconsin, state people, university people. They said, well, yeah, I can find this on the map, but we never heard about a relocation there. So we fired up Google Earth and saw what you see here is that there's this whole town grid. You zoom in, there's blocks. There's like 2 permanent structures left there. There's a Catholic church, and there were at the time a couple of inhabited houses still there. This is the town that numbered up to 10,000 people during its heyday. And now it's 2 inhabited residences, or was it 2 inhabited residences at the time. And if we backed up, what you see is this is Old Odena.
Now to the story of residents of a flooded
And I'm not going to
town
run
where
that.
you had to pick. Now to the story of.
Pause that, sorry. And if you fired up the images in the background there, what you'd see is that it's moved from its floodplain site to a new site. This is about 2.5 miles to the west. That is New Odena. And what's queued up here is we went in there with Rebecca Hersher, who's a journalist with National Public Radio. And this was sort of an embedded situation. We didn't know what we'd found there. Odena is a Native American community, and it's a very interesting narrative about their move and the history of the town and how it's fared since then. Okay, so that happened in the 1970s. Let's fast forward. Robert was talking a little bit about the 1993 flood, the Great Midwestern Flood in the US. So this was a milestone hydrologic event, and it was the time of some of the most famous community relocations in US history. So 3 towns in particular, Pattonsburg, Missouri, Rhineland, Missouri, and the much publicized Valmeyer, Illinois, after this flood resolved never again. They were not the only communities flooded, obviously, but there was interest in flood mitigation. And there was the possibility raised after this event, once and for all, move the town up to high ground. So again, Valmeyer is the most famous example. It's been much discussed. It's been in the news, and with good reason. Valmeyer is widely considered a great success story of community relocation. Dennis Knobloch, the mayor at the time, is illustrated here. He's a vocal advocate for the town and for this process in general. So we've brought people from other towns, from other countries into Valmeyer, and Dennis has been a great friend and source of knowledge for others considering this solution in the future. So again, just very quickly, you saw the old town down there on the floodplain in the image in the background down on the left there, and it's moved up to the northeast about 350 feet higher in elevation. There is all the new structures. There's one. It's the old farmhouse up there on the bluffs, and all the new towns. The town is, since the flood, now about doubled in size. This is from Dennis, an accounting of the original budget. About $31 million to move the town in 1994 dollars, which inflation is just to about $54 million today. So wanted to just mention a couple of the other less publicized examples of community relocation. A smaller town was Rhineland, Missouri, again, hit by the same flood a little bit earlier than Valmeyer, but equally catastrophically. Whereas Valmeyer left a small number, but it's a little over a dozen families decided to leave their residence down on the site of the old. Rhineland, Missouri had only one community member that decided to stay behind. What I like to say is, with a name like Rhineland, good German stock, a sense of community involvement, and they really brought the entire community together. The one structure that was down on the floodplain, inhabited structure, has since been mitigated, and for the most part, again, the community now, it's ball fields down on the floodplain. Nice, tidy residential community up on the bluffs, and well worth the visit. We were in there last year, and they were eager. It's beautiful view down onto the river. And when we were there, the water was up, many of the roads were closed, but everyone was safe and dry in Rhineland. And wanted to mention Pattonsburg, Missouri, the third of the great relocations along the Mississippi-Missouri system after the '93 flood. So again, this is just some of the imagery. The old town is down on the floodplain right there. You have some blowups here of all the structures there. Most of them, not all, but almost all, were removed and a new town designed and built after the 1993 flood. This is a couple miles away to the northeast. So a couple of really interesting things about Pattonsburg. It was moved after being flooded 33 previous times. So we often ask is, what did people think after the 30th flood, the 31st flood, the 32nd flood? What was different in 1993? Well, a couple things. 1993 was really big and it flooded twice. So actually they got hit, this is the Quiver River, they got hit an initial flooding pretty bad in town and then a second wave of flooding just as they were rebuilding. And it's often that 1-2 punch that seems to convince people. Other interesting things about Pattonsburg is after they had built the new town and gotten the residents in there, they actually leased the old downtown site to Ang Lee, who was at the time filming Ride with the Devil. And they burned it down for the movie. So watch the movie sometime when they're burning things down. That's actually old Pattonsburg, burned down and then demolished and now empty floodplains, flood safe ground on the floodplain. There are lots of other case studies that we could discuss. They include other full relocations of towns in the US. There are partial relocations. We could also talk about programs of piecemeal buyouts and some of the advantages and disadvantages of them. There are a couple of town removals and lots of lessons we suggest for how you manage flood risk in the future. If you followed the news, there's a lot of discussion in the US right now about this particular town. This is a Native American community in Louisiana. It's Ile de Jean Charles. It got a $50 million grant from the I think this is the National Disaster Resilience Competition. This has turned into a contentious relocation, really under a national microscope and a lot of local disagreement about whether to move, how to move, where to move, and everything else. Other interesting examples that we don't have time to talk about. Grundy, Virginia, a $400 million project led by the US Army Corps of Engineers to relocate 16 acres of a commercial downtown off the floodplain, mostly to be replaced by a very expensive Walmart on stilts. Another story, not for today. And then you may know that a lot of discussion about managed retreat in the US is focused on the Arctic. So there are at least 12 Native American communities that are seeking relocation to avoid, this is mostly coastal erosion from those different locations. And just wanted to mention a lot of interest in this internationally. So in Australia, at least for river floodplains, the poster child is the town of Grantham. This is in the state of Queensland. It was hit by fatal flooding in 2011. And we've worked with a relocation manager. He's actually an American who worked hand in hand with the mayor for a year and a half, got that community. They were actually in their new homes up on the bluffs 11 months after the flood. Remarkable timetable, a remarkable story told in its entirety in a new book by Jamie Simmons, who is the relocation manager for Grantham. A lot of interest in this in Pacific Island states, focusing on rising sea level. For example, the country of Fiji plans to move a couple dozen of its coastal communities. And we have a student who just got a Fulbright grant to spend a year in Fiji working on these issues. Rough job. And he's happy to be headed there at least once COVID lets him travel again. I just wanted to leave you with one last example super quickly here. And that is lessons learned from managed retreat in Japan. So just wanted to show you a couple quick images. These are 3 photos from the exact same spot in Japan. This is Onagawa in 2006, and here's the exact same spot in 2011. So what's happened here? So that was this. So if you have not yet gone to YouTube and seen, again, not Hollywood footage, but actually what happened during the great 2011 tsunami, it is mind-bending. Again, it's worth, everyone should see this just to see, the force of nature at work. So again, what you see in the background here is a recent photograph. What they have done is retreated from the coast. So, oops, there we go. So here's a local area. Japan, in the area hit by the 2011 tsunami, has allowed no new homes to be built or any homes to be rebuilt in that area. In some cases, this is a 3 to 5 mile wide coastal fringe that has now essentially been depopulated. By all means, this should be high and dry for the future. 145,000 new homes were built, including all new towns. The red in this map is all new communities, and some of these small cities, in effect, built on the bluffs overlooking the coastal plain that was hit by the tsunami. So this is managed retreat on a scale that's almost unimaginable in the US. And I mean, the only real question from this is when we say in the US it's impossible to do large scale community relocation. It seems impossible, but Japan did it. Japan's a very different culture, but one big difference between, let's say, 1993 flood and the 2011 tsunami is the 1993 flood killed something like 53 people at most. Japan lost 20,000 people killed, washed away during this event. This was a wake-up call. If the question is, what does it take to do large-scale managed retreat? Sadly, the answer may be loss of life at that kind of scale. Anyway, sorry. Really quickly, some takeaways. Relocation can be a cost-effective solution for select, usually small rural communities. There are past examples, right? What's the expression about history? Those who forget the lessons of history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. We are doing these things, at least in the US, without fully studying the lessons of past successes and failures. And why the interest in this? Again, we have a large toolkit, a broad array of tools for managing flood risk, but with climate change and spiraling flood damages, there is a need for a wide range of tools as we head into the future. So thank you very much, everyone. I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thanks, Nicholas. At this time, we are open for Q&A. So as I mentioned earlier, please find the Q&A dialogue button on your toolbar on Zoom. And both our presenters are here for about the next 10 minutes, so feel free to ask away.
Don't be shy. Sure, Aaron would be happy to field questions by chat as well.
Yeah, so any way you want to submit those questions, please do so.
Well, we have a minute or two. I could also mention there's underway right now a study on the upper Mississippi River Basin, a flood risk and sediment management study that it's working out of the Rock Island Corps of Engineers. It's really looking at the systemic issues on the upper Mississippi River Basin. There is no real system at this point, and that part of the basin is beset by a regulatory framework that's fragmented. So a lot of different stakeholders involved, a lot of discussion that's necessary, but if nothing's done, then as Dr. Pinter pointed out, if we don't take the information that we've learned and make changes, we can't expect any different outcomes. So history will repeat itself. There is that next major flood coming.
And it looks like we do have a question. So I'll ask it now. We've got a question here that says, how can policies and social controls be more proactive to keep development from continuing unabated in floodplains?
Yeah, I can address that to some extent. I think part of the problem there is that you always have this tension between people who want to use the resources in certain ways, and if you don't have a coherent, consistent policy, it's, as I say, the regulatory framework is pretty fragmented. You can build in the floodplain in many places where you shouldn't be able to. And frankly, that is part of the problem, that we keep building back in certain areas. We've gotten better than we have in the past. There are policies that FEMA and SEMA have changed over the years that make it less likely that that's going to happen. But there really needs to be a consistent regulatory framework that stops developments that aggravate the problems, and that just hasn't quite reached a tipping point where it's as functional as it might be.
We have another question here, and they ask, do you think climate change could ever necessitate the relocation of parts or all of St. Louis?
So, I mean, St. Louis is an interesting example. The more stark example was like New Orleans after Katrina. So there were active discussions about relocation to New Orleans after that catastrophic event, but the conclusion was it's just not feasible. There's too much infrastructure there, even given how dire the long-term prospects are for New Orleans. We're gonna defend it in its present location to the maximum extent possible. You know, St. Louis, I don't see anyone relocating it. Most of historical St. Louis, you know, is up on the bluffs, reasonably safe. It's just the problem is we've expanded into low-lying ground, mostly over the last half century or so. There have been credible discussions. The Dutch have come into St. Louis and proposed not relocation, but a form of managed retreat, what they call room for the rivers. There are certainly room for the rivers solutions available for St. Louis. Bypass channels and other strategies that have been employed elsewhere that are technically feasible, but politically unpopular in the modern day climate, if you will.
I would say there's still a lot of potential, as you pointed out, Dr. Pinter, that to allow the river room. When we're talking about infrastructure such as St. Louis or any community along the river, and you look at the other uses of the floodplain that are also being protected, there's a balancing act that you have to find that right balance. Which is more important? And you know, you're always leaning toward protecting human life and property. Agricultural use of these areas is also obviously very important, but you have to find that right balance where you can store or divert enough of those flows in order to save the most critical infrastructure.
It looks like we have a couple more questions. So one question here says, how do insurance companies play a role in floodplain development?
Yeah, so the National Flood Insurance Program is a really interesting kind of phenomenon. Part of our response to flooding over the years has, you know, been to, well, we established the National Flood Insurance Program, and the communities of the infrastructure within that 100-year floodplain can get insurance, and unfortunately, many people who are in that situation don't get the insurance. It's expensive, and in many instances, even though they don't have insurance after the flood, this kind of aggravates that problem, but we continue to step in and help people out afterwards. Not saying that we shouldn't, but the policy itself, the application of the policy is not conducive to encouraging people to necessarily fully participate in the flood insurance program. So
I have to just jump in very quickly. You know,
sure.
National Flood Insurance Program, NFIP, has a lot of problems. I mean, it's tens of billions of dollars in debt. It's not self-sustaining. Lots of loopholes, and some people argue it enables floodplain development. At the same time, it's worth going back to mid-1960s before NFIP. It was much worse then. Most of that sprawl onto the floodplain occurred before NFIP, and if the program was developed as a solution to the problem, and I think we'd be hard pressed to say it hasn't at least helped, although certainly has not gone far enough.
And I think we have time for about 2 more questions, and this question kind of dovetails into the one that you just answered, so I'll read it now. I recall that FEMA had to retreat from an effort to tighten the NFIP mapping and eligibility late in the 2010s because landowners were shocked to learn that they were affected by newly redrawn floodplain maps. Is there any movement or political will to return to that issue and to abate the use of taxpayer dollars to subsidize landowners who continue to rebuild over and over in floodplains following flood events?
Yeah, so the person's talking about a piece of legislation, Biggert Waters 2012, that was enacted and then rolled back. That was one battle in a long war. So FEMA has gradually tightened and gradually increased premiums on floodplain properties. And that's ongoing despite Biggert Waters being rolled back. What people need to look for in the future is recent changes proposed under what FEMA calls Risk Rating 2.0. And that is a large-scale restructuring of insurance premiums. The story right now is a political one. FEMA, for something like 2 years, has been operating under, last I counted, 13 short-term reauthorizations. Everyone knows that FEMA needs to be fixed, but the current Congress is unwilling to tackle it. Has been punting it 13 different times now.
And I would add to that, I mean, that's kind of the story for so much of flood response and, trying to develop resilience within our systems, is that we spend an incredible amount of funds dealing with flooding and with the issues that we're talking about today. We put a lot of money in planning efforts, and we develop all kinds of strategic approaches that unfortunately don't always get implemented or don't get implemented fully. And there are solutions to all of these problems, at least partial solutions. I mean, nature's always going to challenge us and show us the weakness of our prescience. But at the same time, there are actions that we can take, but they have to be taken consistently over time. And we don't have many distance runners when it comes to public policy. There's oftentimes a great starting point, like this Merrimack River effort that's been started since the 2015 floods. Now is the time that these things need to be implemented. We need to really engage with communities, and something that I hope to do with this Midwest Waters approach, trying to set up some of these forums, but to actually engage with these communities in order to start making your checklist of what projects are going to be done, lining up the resources. And there's tons of resources, but getting those people to the table and start having those conversations so that you can close that loop and actually implement the plans. That's the critical thing.
Okay, I think we have one last question, and that is, there is currently a discussion happening on how to reduce/prevent flooding on the Missouri River in Iowa. Political interests, mainly agricultural driven, are leading the discussion and pushing more levees, etc., that we've used in the past and are winning. How do we help change this perspective or change to more beneficial practices to prevent and reduce flooding?
I'll just jump in. I was asked to write an op-ed, a short article for Scientific American last summer when the Missouri was in full flood, and I reviewed the history of levees only. So basically the 1800s, the first half of the 1900s was all about building more bigger levees. And I'd suggest that's a 19th century technology. Here in the 21st century, a lot of the world is moving in the opposite direction, and that's towards room for the rivers. So this is a whole separate topic of conversation. Robert may want to jump in, but I'd suggest we need to look at 21st century solutions for managing our flood risk, not going backwards and always incessantly just raising levees whenever anyone suggests it.
Yeah, and what I would add to that is that you have to look beyond the riverbank. You have to actually look beyond the floodplain if you're going to really change the outcomes here. The fact is you can build a lot of resilience into systems by looking back up the watershed and looking at an aggregate of conservation measures. We've spent the last 200 years trying to get the water off the landscape as quickly as possible. We need to reverse that thinking, and we are to some extent already, but you've got to let the water infiltrate higher to get it off, to move it off the surface as quickly as possible is adding to the problem. And then every step along the way where you can reestablish wetlands and manage, improve infiltration. Those are the things that can aggregate to improvements in the system if they're implemented broadly.
Okay, I think that was our final question. So I do want to thank you, Robert and Nicholas, for sharing your work and research with us this morning. Today's program was inspired by our special exhibit, Mighty Mississippi. If it's safe for you, we encourage you to make a reservation and come to the Missouri History Museum in Forest Park to check out the exhibit for yourself. Today's Living with the River presentation is the second in a series of 6 of our river conversations. We hope that you join us in the fall for conversations about valuing the river, protecting the river, communicating about the river, and reconnecting with the river. Also, there are 2 to 3 STL History Live programs each week. You can see the next few listed on your screen right now, but you can also visit mohistory, mohistory.org, or Facebook to check out more upcoming virtual programming. So thanks again for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.